I want to thank you. I want to thank Senator Duckworth. We at DAV have known Tammy for many, many years, and I've worked with her personally on many occasions. She's a former Disabled American Veteran of the Year, and she's served our country, and she's served her fellow veterans with great honor and distinction. I'd also like to thank our friends at the War Horse and the Harris School of Public Policy for hosting this event and inviting me to be here to represent DAV and talk about my experiences with burn pits. Earlier, I heard Bob Woodward talk about his experience as a young Navy officer meeting Mark Felt for the first time. And recently, I was told that some of my colleagues at work have, behind my back, called me the deep throat of burn pits. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know, if you really wonder why you've never heard of me before, it's because sometimes the way we choose language determines if you want to be recognized or not. When I was 16 years old, my mother told me that she didn't know where I would be living when I turned 18, but that it wouldn't be at my childhood home in Lincoln, Nebraska. As Providence would have it, there was a message on the family answering machine at that very moment from a Marine recruiter. I enlisted and found myself on the famous yellow footprints in San Diego when I was still 17. And I knew in that very moment that nothing that had happened before in my life mattered. I was trained to be a combat correspondent, and my first awareness of environmental impact of military service came when I was working as a combat correspondent at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, when our facilities made the dreaded base realignment and closure list. It was then that the community in Southern California realized the real estate they were gaining wasn't a clean deal. While the trichloroethylene contamination from leaking drums at El Toro apparently wasn't a significant concern for the Marines living there, the toxic waste dump, as one toxicologist called it, was a major concern for the civilians inheriting it. I finished my last year in the Marine Corps in Okinawa, working for American Forces Network as a broadcaster, and returned to Orange County. Transitioning out to work for an ad agency, I really didn't feel that I had a lot in common with my colleagues who'd spent that same period of time in college and interning for Disney. As my inactive reserve time in the military was timing out, I decided to join the California Air National Guard. It wasn't going to be the same as the Marine Corps, but it was, even if it seemed only technically true at the time, still the military. I re-enlisted in the summer of 2001 and had a couple very fun weekends where the beers at the base bar were as memorable as the training. But that changed for everyone weeks later on 9/11. Waking up that morning, like most Americans, my instant thought was, how can I respond? Instead of feeling helpless, I put on my uniform and reported to March Field for duty. That night we supported the airlift of FEMA teams to Ground Zero. And on the way home, flying over Chicago's airspace, the pilot called me to the cockpit. "Look out here," he told me, "what do you see?" And of course, I didn't see anything, but that was his point. The pilot was a reservist who flew for United. If it wasn't obvious before, the dearth of aircraft in one of the busiest airspaces in the world was a testament to how much the world had changed. From 9/11 onward, my goal was to deploy and support the war. The first time I was able to get orders, I went ahead and broke my ankle and lost my slot. The second set of orders took me to the island of Crete. And while that mission was important, with refuelers supporting combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, building at a resort didn't feel like an authentic war experience to me. With some lobbying, my third set of orders got me much closer. I was going to Iraq, and I'd be at the base that hosted the Air Force Theater Hospital. I was disappointed we'd not be leaving the wire, though if I really wanted to do that, I probably should have stayed in the Marine Corps, but I would be supporting the war. Coming to Iraq, I figured the most dangerous part of the whole tour would probably be the landing. But the most remarkable thing happened after that. You see, people can tell you about Iraq. They can show you pictures or videos, but to experience Iraq is to smell it. And coming off the plane, the first thing that greeted all of us was the open-air burn pit. It was the largest of its kind in operation. You did not need to be a toxicologist or environmental engineer to know, at best, what you were inhaling was disgusting. You could taste the burn pit even before you realized what you were consuming with every breath. It was inherently awful. If there was any doubt, seeing the pits in action would confirm your concerns. The dichotomies at Balad were incredible. The former Iraqi Air Force Base was named Mortar-Reedaville for the daily rocket and mortar attacks we sustained. And while few of the airmen who lived there left the base, the greatest danger for most may have been the burn pits. At the hospital there, docs achieved an incredible 90% plus survivability rate for patients they could see within the golden hour of sustaining even the most violent combat wounds. That said, it's remarkable to consider that the gateway out of Iraq for anyone being medically evacuated from the theater ran through a toxic plume. It's possible in time that Balad's smoldering landmark and others throughout Iraq, Afghanistan, and other deployed locations may ultimately have more devastating health consequences for its survivors than combat operations were through the duration of the war. While I was in Iraq, I never gave up my civilian job. That I worked for DAV was well known. I was a liaison at the hospital. I volunteered as much as I could in any capacity that was needed. It was great to be able to connect folks with resources and make sure they knew they weren't going to be alone when many of them knew their wounds would end their military careers. So when my boss called us in for a meeting about the burn pits, the memo we saw was shocking. Darren Curtis, a bioenvironmental flight engineer, had reported internally that the burn pit was as bad or worse than most people could imagine. The memo, that was already a year old, received concurrence that it was an acute and chronic health hazard. I realized that I was effectively on a crisis communications team for one of the most potentially disabling toxic exposure sites on the planet. Meanwhile, I was also on the communications team of a congressionally chartered voice for our nation's disabled American veterans. Sometimes life puts you in a position where the exact wrong thing to do is also the exact right thing to do. The only moment I second-guessed what happened next was when I was actively scanning the document I'd received from the memo from Colonel Curtis to send it back to DAV, and my major walked in. So I was a little nervous, I'm slowing down. I figured he knew I was up to something, so I just said to him, I work for DAV, right? I said, this is gonna be out. This is gonna be in the media. And he said to me in a typical career officer voice, I don't care as long as it comes out while I'm at my next duty station. He knew it was the right thing to do. Burt Field, the general running the Air Force in Iraq, knew the existence of burn pits was wrong as well. At every commander's call, and he admitted as much, he was asked about the burn pit. And he was a fighter pilot. He had a war to win. He did care about his troops, but he's also concerned about how the pit's smoke trail could shut down combat operations. Sadly, the will wasn't there to change anything, even after Colonel Curtis's memo. We were told about incinerators that could come online or couldn't come online for one bureaucratic reason or another. We couldn't turn over our trash to our enemy. We didn't want to put more humans at greater risk to wash dishes so we could replace styrofoam utensils in a war zone. The base was expeditionary in nature. Generals are trained to fight and win. But with more than 30,000 people on the base and the unique nature of military refuse, Balad generated tons of trash and debris without the resources of a city to manage permanent infrastructure. When the folks at DAV got the memo, they were appalled. We were an organization led at that time almost entirely by Vietnam veterans. They see words like dioxins and they think of Agent Orange. Carrie Baker, a 10-year DAV staff member, was our legislative lead and an experienced benefits advocate. If troops were going to deal with an exposure remotely like Agent Orange, DAV was going to lobby every play in the book that worked with Agent Orange to fight it. But to get proper sight picture on the problem, we needed to start with the process of identifying those who'd been exposed and get research churning to validate a service connection for those who were sick. And to get anything of consequence done, we'd need to be strategic in how we approach the military and veterans community and the public. That's where Kelly Kennedy came in. Kelly was a known quantity for DAV. She was one of us. She'd put her life on the line to tell stories about her fellow soldiers. She was a fighter. She was true to the cause. The Military Times, who she worked for, was a behemoth in terms of its reach and credibility to that community. And Kelly was the kind of person we felt would work with us. She wasn't going to let go of the story either, and she hasn't. But I remember the story coming to light when it first aired, or first was published, and feeling it was kind of anticlimactic. I felt it was important, but wasn't sure what would come of it. And of course, you have to consider how overwhelmed we were at the time by what was frankly a lot, and I mean a lot, of celebrity bullshit in the news. But the story supported other efforts. The first thing we were able to work together with Military Times and Kelly on was the establishment of a registry. At that time, a DAV registry, and we started to collect information from people who'd been exposed. You can't have a registry if no one knows about it. And then we started to see momentum to close down burn pits, mind you, as long as they weren't essential, which was further tacit acknowledgement of the problem and a way to sort of stop the bleeding in terms of exposures for folks still serving in the war. The DAV registry was a forerunner to VA's registry. We knew we had to start looking at ways to initiate more research and gather more information to validate the stories we began hearing from the folks who were disabled from their exposures and the spouses of those who died too soon. We knew from experience that there was going to be a price tag to pay for the care and benefits of those exposed. And the price tag alone was likely to determine how hard the fight would be. There was never a thought that this would be easy. It would have to be fought like everything else that we did. We'd need to get a toehold here and there and keep climbing. But it felt like a sheer rock cliff in the beginning. Without telling the stories of the survivors and those who were suffering, we weren't going to get the momentum we needed to make justice happen any faster than it did for veterans of past exposures. For our own magazine, DAV's magazine, we teamed with Kelly and an award-winning photographer named Nina Berman. That's something we'd never done before, but it definitely moved the needle. We honored Kelly with our Bugle Award for the effort, and that was just another way of doing the right thing while trying to spread more awareness of the issue. I blogged about it for the New York Times, and we made it a priority for our members every time they interacted with their elected officials. It's been that priority now for 15 years and will remain so. The Pact Act is probably the most significant sign in the last 100 years of our nation making a decision to change the course of our future by recognizing the shortcomings of our past. It's not only that it's not the only piece of legislation that does that, but it's a reflection, if we're honest with ourselves, largely of Vietnam-era veterans who fought for the last half century to ensure subsequent generations enjoy a justice that was, at best, overdue for their generation. You all know this saying about success having many fathers and failure being a lonely orphan. In the case of burn pits, it's true that many, many people contributed to the effort. And we're proud to work with many groups and individuals to craft and help lay the groundwork for that effort. One of the most significant windfalls for exposed veterans has, of course, been our headliner tonight, Jon Stewart, who's used his celebrity and genuine concern for veterans, and sadly, in many cases, their survivors, to give the issue a spotlight you won't get from an overweight Air Force veteran who rarely left the wire and is worse still, a spokesperson. We needed Jon Stewart. We even needed the bandwagoners who came on late and those who didn't do much more than talk about the legislation after all the real work had been done. Because even they have a role to play in a battle that isn't finished. And we need people like DAV's Shane Learman, who without tremendous fanfare has done a ton of the work involved in helping create legislation that is capable of being passed. We celebrate a victory for veterans with the Pact Act, but to me it feels hollow. Yes, for many it's justice, but still, many have already died. And when you look at the laundry list of cancers and toxic and chronic conditions that are now presumptives, it's clear that the benefits the bill will provide don't outweigh the suffering the legislation presents. Still, weeks ago, I was diagnosed with my first, and I hope my last, chronic health condition that is presumptive. The Pact Act, as you know, is not exclusively for burn pits. It will support all generations of veterans, many of whom have seen justice delayed and denied. And it will support many more who don't yet know that they carried home something from the war that will cut their being short or affect the quality of their lives for decades to come. The beauty, though, the thing that should bring the most comfort to veterans and our families, is how the Act makes us more nimble in adjusting to and providing benefits for the new presumptives that we'll likely find in the future. For DAV's part, I'm proud that we celebrated by immediately turning gears to use the momentum from the Pact Act to put a focus on Karshi-Kanabad veterans. Those folks who were at a former base in Uzbekistan in advance of the war in Afghanistan were living with radioactive sludge before burn pits were even a thing. K2 veterans talk about a body of water that formed a bulldozed section of the former Soviet base that they called Skittles Pond because it had every color in the rainbow they'd seen in their MRE candies. They are part of the next frontier, and we can't rest until justice is achieved for them, their families, and sadly, their survivors. When people join the military, beyond, in my case, considering pending homelessness, they think of the risks of combat. They wonder if they'll be brave in the face of the enemy. They wonder if they'll be true to their brothers or be willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice if called to do so. But somehow, in addition to the physical demands and harrowing experiences we prepare men and women to encounter in service, we seem to find creative ways to poison otherwise healthy people we ask to defend our country. I've worked with a group called Military Veterans in Journalism to prepare veterans to go out to newsrooms to speak about responsibly covering veterans issues and to call for a more thoughtful, concerted effort towards understanding and investing in coverage that affects change. I'm also working with the National Association of Broadcasters, DAV, to do the same thing, to get more folks in newsrooms. But the problem remains. Today's newsrooms need to feed the content monster. It's extremely rare for any publication to have a journalist like Kelly Kennedy, who is such a passionate and dedicated voice for our community. But it's something we should aim for. I'm grateful again for the opportunity to speak today, and I hope this event, its distinguished speakers and guests, will inspire and elevate the public dialogue where veterans are concerned. As veterans represent an increasingly smaller segment of the population, we need to be more vocal ourselves and have more allies to ensure we can still achieve justice for the many who've sacrificed for our nation. If we're going to continue to ask people to face the dangers inherent in military service, we're going to have to show future generations that we will care for them when they're changed in service. To that end, I would like to thank the University of Chicago and Warhorse for facilitating and creating such an important forum. And now it is my sincere and great honor to welcome my dear friend, Kelly Kennedy, and a true friend of veterans, Secretary Dennis McDonough, to discuss the future of VA healthcare. Thank you all for your time. Thank you.